It is the second week of September 1944, somewhere east of the Westwall, and a Wehrmacht intelligence officer is bent over a folding table inside a requisitioned farmhouse, trying to work out where his own reserves actually are. The map in front of him is a pre-war Generalstabskarte, printed years before the front had any reason to move this far west, its contour lines still accurate but its road network already out of date, its bridges marked that no longer stand, its forest edges drawn from a survey older than some of the men now dying in the fighting around them. Outside, a battery commander waits for coordinates. The officer measures with a pair of dividers, checks a grid reference twice, and still cannot be entirely sure which farm track leads where. Across the line, an American artillery liaison officer is doing the same job with a sheet of paper that did not exist a fortnight earlier, a photomosaic assembled from reconnaissance flights over that exact stretch of ground, updated, cross-referenced, and rushed forward through a supply chain built for precisely this purpose. Neither man knows it yet, but the war in front of them is already being fought, in part on unequal terms drawn in ink and grayscale photograph, long before a single round is fired. A remark later attributed to a German staff officer, recorded without a name in Allied intelligence summaries after the campaign, put it plainly. The Americans, he said, seem to know his own country better than his own army did. This is the story of how that became true, and why it mattered more than almost anyone on either side realized at the time. The problem the Wehrmacht faced was not a lack of maps. Germany had, on paper, one of the most sophisticated cartographic traditions in Europe, built on more than a century of Prussian and then German military survey work. The issue was that this tradition had frozen in place just as the war it was meant to serve began accelerating past it. Standard issue Generalstabskarten, at scales of 1 to 100,000 and 1 to 25,000, had been surveyed in painstaking detail across Germany, France, and much of Eastern Europe, often in the 1930s or even earlier, and were beautifully precise about things that do not change quickly: hills, rivers, the shape of a valley. They were far less reliable about things that change constantly in wartime: new roads cut for military traffic, bridges blown and hastily rebuilt, villages flattened by bombing, rail lines rerouted, entire farms bulldozed for airstrips. By 1944, on multiple fronts simultaneously, German forces were fighting across terrain that had been reshaped by 5 years of war using paper that mostly predated it. Revising these maps required trained surveyors, printing presses, paper stock, and above all time, and Germany by the middle of the war had a shortage of all four, compounded by fuel restrictions on the aerial reconnaissance flights that would have been needed to update them in the first place. Fremde Heer West and Fremde Heer Ost, the Army's intelligence branches for the Western and Eastern fronts, were left trying to plot the movement of entire armies using a picture of the ground that was, in places, years stale. On the Eastern Front, the problem was worse again, because German forces had advanced in 1941 into regions for which pre-war Soviet mapping was itself patchy, deliberately falsified in places for security reasons, or simply absent at the scale infantry commanders needed. A regimental officer might have an excellent map of the wrong decade, or an approximate map of the right one, but rarely both accurate and current at once. The gap between what commanders needed to know and what their maps could tell them was not a minor inconvenience. It was, by the last 2 years of the war, a structural weakness baked into how the German army planned and fought. There was also a deeper institutional problem underneath the paper shortage, one that had little to do with printing presses and everything to do with priorities. Cartography is, by its nature, a discipline that rewards patience, and patience was not a resource Germany had in surplus after 1942. Every trained surveyor pulled onto the Eastern Front to revise a sector map was a surveyor not available to update material for the West, and vice versa. And the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme found itself trying to service 2, and eventually 3, active fronts with a workforce and a printing capacity sized for the peacetime demands of a single country. Fuel allocation compounded the difficulty further. Aerial resurvey depended on aircraft, and aircraft depended on petrol that the Luftwaffe increasingly needed for fighter defense over the Reich itself, rather than slow, repeated photographic passes over quiet sectors of front. The result was a kind of triage in which only the most urgently threatened stretches of line received anything like current mapping, while wide swathes of rear areas, supply routes, and secondary defensive positions were left to be understood through documents that might have been perfectly serviceable in 1940 and were dangerously misleading by 1944. The American solution grew out of an institution most people have never heard of, the Army Map Service, based at Brookmount in Washington, D.C., working alongside the Army Air Force's Photographic Intelligence Units, and in Britain, the Central Interpretation Unit at Danesfield House in Buckinghamshire, better known by its wartime cover name, RAF Medmenham. The principle behind the American approach was straightforward to state and formidably difficult to execute. Maps should not merely be accurate, they should be current, and currency mattered more than tradition. Rather than relying solely on pre-war ground survey, the Allied mapping effort was built around a continuous cycle of aerial photography, feeding directly into cartographic production. Reconnaissance aircraft, principally modified Spitfires and Mosquitoes flying unarmed at high altitude for the RAF, and P-38 Lightnings adapted for photography for the Americans, flew repeated sorties over the same ground, sometimes daily in active sectors, building up overlapping sequences of vertical photographs that could be viewed in stereo pairs to reveal not just what a road looked like, but its width, its surface, whether it could bear the weight of a tank column. Photo interpreters at Medmenham, working with stereoscopes not much larger than a pair of binoculars mounted on a small frame, could measure the shadow cast by a newly dug earthwork and calculate its depth to within inches. This photographic intelligence fed a production pipeline that could turn updated imagery into a printed, gridded map in a matter of days rather than the months or years a full-ground resurvey would have required. The Army Map Service alone is estimated to have produced several 100 million individual map sheets over the course of the war, an output on a scale that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht's own cartographic branch, the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, could match once its resources were spread thin across multiple collapsing fronts. Crucially, American and British mapping used a standard military grid system, allowing artillery, infantry, and air support to reference the same point on the ground with a short string of numbers rather than relying on named features that a badly printed or outdated map might place in slightly the wrong location. A map, in this system, was not a static reference object. It was closer to a perishable good, produced, distributed, used, and superseded on a rolling basis, matched to the pace of the campaign it supported rather than to the pace at which a pre-war drawing office could work. The physical process behind this was less glamorous than the aircraft that made it possible, but no less important. A returning reconnaissance sortie's exposed film would be rushed to a processing unit, developed within hours, and handed to interpreters who examined it under magnification, laying successive overlapping frames side by side to build a continuous strip of the ground below. Where a stereoscope revealed a genuine change, a new bridge, a fresh trench line, a dispersal area cut into a wood, that change was marked, cross-referenced against the existing base map, and passed to a drawing office for incorporation. Printing itself relied on lithographic plates that could be revised far more quickly than a full engraved survey sheet, allowing a corrected map to be run off in a printing shed roughly the size of a large barn and distributed forward through the same logistics chain that carried ammunition and rations. The comparison the production teams themselves sometimes used was that of a newspaper rather than a reference book. The map was expected to go stale, and the entire point of the system was to keep replacing it before staleness became dangerous. Distribution mattered as much as production. It did an artillery battery no good to have an accurate map sitting in a depot 40 miles behind the line. so American and British logistics planners treated updated map sheets as a supply priority in their own right, moved forward alongside fuel and ammunition rather than as an afterthought once everything more urgent had been delivered. The practical effect of this gap showed up repeatedly on the ground in 1944 and 1945, though it rarely appears in headline accounts of the campaigns themselves, which tend to focus on tanks and infantry rather than the paperwork that guided them. In Normandy, American engineers and artillery units operated from mapping updated from photographic sorties flown within days of the invasion, allowing fire missions to be plotted against features that had not existed or had already changed when the last German survey of the region was made. During the advance across France in the late summer of 1944, forward air controllers and artillery liaison teams were able to call in strikes using coordinates cross-checked against recent photography, while German units in the same sectors, retreating and often cut off from resupply, were in places relying on maps that predated the destruction of the very bridges and road junctions marked on them. Records from the fighting around the Falaise Pocket describe German staff struggling to coordinate a breakout using maps that no longer matched a landscape churned by weeks of bombardment and armored movement, a mismatch between paper and ground that compounded the chaos of an already desperate retreat. It is worth being honest about the limits of the documentary record here. Precise causal claims that a specific German unit was destroyed specifically because of an outdated map rather than any of the dozen other disadvantages it faced in the collapse of the Normandy front, are difficult to substantiate and easy to overstate. What is better documented is the pattern. Repeated post-war debriefings and captured after-action reports describe German officers expressing frustration at the unreliability of their own cartographic material relative to what they judged the Allies to be working from, based on captured American map sheets that some German units acquired and were startled to find more current than their own. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 offers a further well-attested example of the same underlying weakness, even though the German plan there depended on speed and surprise rather than sustained artillery accuracy. German columns pushing west through the Losheim Gap and toward the Meuse were, in places, relying on road classifications and bridge capacity ratings that had not been checked against the actual condition of the network for months, at exactly the moment when the entire operational plan depended on those roads bearing the weight of armored columns on a tight timetable. American engineer units, by contrast, were working from photographic updates that let them identify, block, and in some cases demolish specific bridges with confidence that they understood precisely what they were denying the enemy, rather than working from an assumption about what a map from an earlier season of the war suggested should be there. None of this should be read as claiming that mapping alone determined the outcome of the bulge, which turned on fuel shortages, weather, and the stubbornness of scattered American defenders as much as on anything drawn on paper. But the cartographic imbalance sat quietly underneath all of those better-known factors, shaping how quickly each side could translate intent into movement. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. The comparison becomes sharper when set against what German forces themselves attempted to do about the problem, because it was not for want of trying. German units frequently supplemented official military mapping with captured civilian material, most famously pre-war Michelin road maps of France, which, while useful for road classification and general orientation, lacked the military grid references, terrain detail, and defensive feature marking that a proper tactical map required. This was, in effect, an admission of the gap, an army built around precise Prussian staff work resorting to a commercial road atlas because its own survey pipeline could not keep pace with the front. American units suffered no equivalent shortfall, in part because the Army Map Service coordinated closely with the Army Air Force's reconnaissance squadrons and the British survey and photographic establishments, creating a single integrated pipeline from aerial sortie to printed sheet in Allied hands, whereas German aerial reconnaissance capacity, particularly after the near-total loss of Luftwaffe air superiority from 1943 onward, was increasingly unable to fly the repeated sorties that currency and mapping required. It is a point worth stating plainly. A reconnaissance aircraft that cannot survive contact with enemy fighters cannot photograph the ground below it, and an air force fighting for its own survival over its own cities has little capacity left to spare for the patient, repetitive photographic work that good mapping depends on. The Soviet Union, fighting German forces on the other front, presents a more mixed picture, since Soviet mapping in this period ranged from excellent large-scale military survey work in some sectors to deliberately inaccurate civilian mapping elsewhere. A legacy of pre-war security policy that, ironically, sometimes hampered Soviet forces' own use of captured or older Soviet material as much as it ever confused a German invader. The clearest contrast, then, is not simply American cartographic skill against German incompetence, since German pre-war survey work was, on its own terms, excellent, but rather the difference between a mapping system built to be renewed continuously under wartime conditions and one that had no realistic mechanism left to keep pace once the war turned against the side that depended on it. The consequences of this gap were real, but they were also, by their nature, difficult to measure with precision, and it is worth resisting the temptation to claim more certainty than the historical record supports. Good maps did not win battles by themselves, and plenty of German units fought with skill and cohesion despite working from imperfect cartography, just as plenty of American units made costly mistakes despite having excellent maps in hand. What can be said with more confidence is that accurate current mapping reduced friction at every level of operations, from the artillery officer plotting a fire mission to the logistics planner routing a supply convoy around a bridge that no longer existed, and that this reduction in friction compounded across thousands of small decisions made every day across a theater of war. It shaved minutes off decisions that, multiplied across an army, became hours, and it removed a category of error, being simply wrong about the ground itself, that a well-supplied intelligence apparatus could otherwise spend disproportionate effort correcting. The Army Map Service's wartime methods, particularly its integration of continuous aerial photography with rapid print production, directly influenced post-war military cartography and fed into the mapping infrastructure later absorbed by the Defense Mapping Agency, while photo interpretation techniques pioneered at Medmenham shaped Allied and later NATO reconnaissance doctrine for decades afterward. Original wartime map sheets from both sides survive today in archives including the National Archives at Kew, the U.S. National Archives at College Park, and the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, where the contrast between a crisp, gridded, recently revised Allied sheet and a beautifully engraved but years-stale German Generalstabskarte can still be examined side by side, a quiet physical record of an advantage that rarely appears in the popular memory of the war at all. Return for a moment to that farmhouse east of the Westwall, to the officer with his dividers and his pre-war map, still uncertain exactly where his own reserves stood. He was not a poor soldier, and the army he served was not short of technical skill. What he lacked was something less visible than a rifle or a tank, and considerably harder to replace once lost: an accurate, current picture of the ground his war was actually being fought on. Across the line, the American liaison officer with his fresh photomosaic held no obvious weapon at all, nothing that would show up in a tally of tanks or guns or aircraft, and yet he held something that shaped the outcome of the fighting almost as surely as any of them. He knew where the road actually went. He knew which bridge was still standing. He knew, in short, the ground, in a way his opposite number increasingly did not. The remark attributed to that unnamed German staff officer, that the enemy seemed to know his own country better than his own army did, was not really a comment about espionage or treachery, and nothing in the record suggests he meant it that way. It was a comment about paper, ink, and photographs, about grid references and print runs, about an unglamorous logistical and technical effort that never once fired a shot and yet quietly reshaped how the last years of the war were fought. Armies are remembered for their tanks and their generals, for the great set-piece battles and the famous names attached to them. They are rarely remembered for their cartographers. But somewhere in a photographic laboratory in Buckinghamshire, or a drawing office in Washington, the outcome of battles yet to be fought was already being drawn, quietly, one contour line and one grid square at a time, by people whose names appear in almost no history of the war at all. The enemy did not know his country better than he did because of any failure of German cartography as a discipline. He knew it better because his own side could still afford to look, again and again, at ground that was changing faster than any peacetime survey had ever needed to account for, while the other side could not. That, in the end, was the whole of the advantage, and it was more than enough.